of my talk, Knowing Through Nursing, comes from Shakespeare's King Lear. A series of tragic events lead to the blinding of Lear's old friend Gloucester. His son, Edgar, disguised as a mad beggar, sees his father through his final sufferings and death. As the play comes to an end, Edgar is asked, "How have you known the miseries of your father?" And Edgar responds, "By nursing them, my lord." I love the idea that Edgar comes to know by nursing. This is a key question in the philosophy of nursing. What are the ways of knowing that belong to nursing as a discipline and practice? How do the nurse's ways of knowing belong to the embodied skill and craft of the practitioner? What about the caregiver's relational attunement to others? What about the affordances of the designed environment of healing? And the ethical, spiritual, cultural, and even aesthetic outlooks of the parties? What is the role of the family and the community in healing? How does inequity affect access to knowledge, training, and resources? And how does the nurse engage with those factors and herself suffer them? Miriam Bender, our host and my colleague, and Dina Elias argue that, quote, "the aesthetic pattern of knowing is critical for nursing practice." Bender contrasts aesthetic with an E and aesthetic with an AE, whereas the Greek term has come to be identified with artistic experience. She drops the A in order to encompass a broader range of experience, including clinical expertise, clinical judgment, tacit knowledge, and human caring. Well, Shakespeare is aesthetic in both senses, right? He clearly created art that helps audiences expand our imaginative and mental capacities. As an actor and theater maker, he was also practicing a craft composed of an ensemble of physical, mental, emotional, and interpersonal skills: dance and sword fighting, memorizing and declaiming, listening and responding. Both actors and nurses respond to situations with tact, empathy, embodied knowledge, and a worldview that is based on shared stories, maxims, and commitments. And when Shakespeare represents scenes of care, he sometimes manifests an understanding of these and other virtues shared by nurses and actors. He also depicts care in social settings that are shaped by gender, class, and cultural expectations, as well as by features of the built environment. Care is a performance, an action that takes place among persons and sometimes in front of persons, in real time and space, as a dialogue or conversation that unfolds in response to stories and story types of birthing, growing, healing, aging, and dying. As exercises in care, nursing and acting are examples of affective labor. That means forms of employment that use and sometimes use up the personal presence, attention, and life story of the worker in the service of others. Teaching is also affective labor. Nurses and actors are also organizational workers who pursue goals in concert with others in purposeful environments. Thinking about nursing from both the care perspective, which is deeply personal and affective, and the organizational perspective, which emphasizes distributed cognition and environmental affordances, has helped me see Shakespeare's performances of care in a new way. I'm going to share some of my thoughts with you today. The most famous nurse in Shakespeare is known simply as the nurse. She is the comic, body-loving, and pragmatic nanny of Juliet Capulet. And of course, she's not a nurse in our modern sense at all. The word nurse is from the Anglo-French nourrice, meaning wet nurse. To nurse means to nourish. Although later applied to the duties of the sick nurse, the term itself implies the advancement of health, the cultivation of flourishing as its central end or aim. And although the nurse's aim in Romeo and Juliet sometimes misses its mark due to the distorted values of the aristocratic family and her own lapses in judgment, the nurse remains constant in her careful attention to her young charge. In the first scene with Juliet, the nurse recounts her relationship with the Capulet family.
Nurse! Where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
Now, by my maidenhead at 12-year-old, I bade her come. What lamb? What ladybird? God forbid, where's this girl? What Juliet?
Hello, who calls?
Your mother.
Oh, madam, I am here. What is your will? This is the matter. Nurse, give leave a while. We must talk in secret. Nurse, come back again. I have remembered me. Thou's here our counsel. Thou knowst my daughter's of a pretty age.
Faith, I can tell her age into an hour.
She's not 14.
I lay 14 in my teeth, she's not 14. How long is it now till Lammastide?
Fortnights and odd days.
Or even odd. Of all the days of the year, come Lammas Eve at night, shall she be 14? Susan and she, God rest all Christian souls, were of an age. Well, Susan is with God. She was too good for me. Mary, I remember it well. 'Tis since the earthquake now, 11 years, and she was weaned. I never shall forget it. Of all the days of the year upon that day. For I had then laid wormwood to me dug, sitting in the sun under the dove house wall. Me lord knew her then at Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. And since that time, it is 11 years. For then she could stand alone. Even the day before, she broke her brow. And then me husband, God be with his soul, oh, was a merry man, took up the child. Yea, quoth he, just to fall upon thy face, thou wilt fall backwards when thou hast more wit, wilt thou not, Julie? And by my holly dam, the pretty wretch left crying and said, aye! To see now our jest may come about. I warrant I should live 1,000 years, I never should forget it. Wilt thou not, Jolie? Quoth he. Pretty fool, it stinted and said, aye!
Enough of this, I pray thee, hold thy peace.
And I warrant, it had upon it brow a bump as big as a young cockerel's stone. Yea, quoth me husband, fall'st upon thy face, thou wilt fall backwards when thou comest of age. Wilt thou not, Jolie? It's
I pray thee, nurse, say aye.
Please, I've done. Oh, God mark thee to his grace. Thou wast the prettiest babe that e'er I nursed, and I might live to see thee married once. I have me wish.
Marry! That marry is the very theme I came to talk of.
Often played for laughs, there's actually a lot going on there. We learn that the nurse's own daughter, Susan, the same age as Juliet, had died, freeing the nurse's breasts and her affective labor for the care of Juliet. So the work of mourning is built into the office of care. We also learn that she used a home remedy, wormwood, to wean Juliet. And there's a lot of bawdy jesting. Like a midwife, the nurse knows all about sex, and she's going to put that knowledge to use later in the play. All of this unfolds within the memory of an environment of care. The nurse weaned baby Juliet sitting in the sun under the dove house wall. The spatial notation mixes warmth and shade, open air and partial seclusion, the crafted solidity of architecture with the ambient presence of birds. The nurse has chosen a location for weaning that supports their own bodies as a caring dyad, while other forms of life stir and beckon around them. The rhythmic composite of wall, ground, sky, breath, breast, and birds contribute to what Bender and Holmes call the world as process, in which reality is a continuous construction, and subject and object are products, not independent constituents of that reality. I think you get a sense of that process as reality in this Impressionist painting by Mary Cassatt, in which human subjects, human objects, physical objects, and the process of washing merge with the act of painting itself. The scene is a recollection, but it's also an action, a dance of solicitudes involving three parties, not two. Juliet sometimes jumps on the nurse's lap to relive this tale of her toddlerhood. Meanwhile, Lady Capulet strives for intimacy when she sends the nurse away, but then she loses confidence and decides to recall the nurse. The affective labor of the nurse compensates for the emotional distance of the mother, and the nurse becomes a mediator between the mother and the daughter, able to facilitate a tough conversation about marriage that Lady Capulet is unable to initiate on her own. The nurse's speech evokes a whole world defined by patterns of privilege and labor, work and rest, and human and animal cohabitation. It's really not a description so much as an abstraction, in the sense that is defined by Professor Bender. The nurse assembles the conditions that matter for what we have a care for and want to produce as a potential future reality. It is a selective description oriented towards the shared environment of care that she and Juliet build together. An environment is literally that which environs or surrounds, as the courtyard enveloped nurse and child that summer afternoon. An environment is also that which flows and interconnects. It's a web of exchanges that's vulnerable to disturbance. And nurses are managers of environments. They are organizational workers in a stratified and intricate domestic economy. We can understand the nurse's organizational duties by turning to two kinds of texts from the period: midwifery manuals and housekeeping guides. I'm especially interested in books by women, though they are written decades after Shakespeare's death, including this guide for midwives by Jane Sharp and the domestic guides of Hannah Woolley, sometimes called the Martha Stewart of the 17th century. Jane Sharp describes the ideal nurse in terms that sound a lot like Shakespeare's nurse. And you can see this discourse embodied in this wonderful portrait of a nurse and child by Franz Hals. Sharp writes, "A nurse ought to be of a good complexion and constitution. A good, wholesome nurse may correct the natural humors of the child if the mother has an ill complexion herself. The nurse should be of a ruddy, merry, cheerful, delightsome countenance, and clear-skinned, so that her veins appear through it. Such a woman is sociable, not subject to melancholy. She is jovial and will sing and dance, taking great delight in children." This portrait of a type is also a study in processes. Complexion, constitution, and humor are all process words. They refer to the humoral medicine that still reigned in the period, which conceived of the human mind and body as part of a shifting climate of humors. And the nurse was herself a manager of processes, caring for the climate changes of her charge, caring for Juliet's own complexion and constitution. The nurse was a manager of processes in another sense, because she participated in the personnel, workflow, and technologies of a largely self-sustaining Renaissance household. Hannah Woolley wrote a guide for women domestic workers that included the nursery maid in its inventory of employment possibilities, with the waiting woman or lady in waiting at the very top to the scullery maid at the bottom. The nursemaid was towards the middle of this hierarchy. Shakespeare's nurse seems rather to combine nursery maid and housekeeper. Housekeepers and nurses were expected to master basic medicine. Woolley's book provides the choicest receipts or recipes and rarest secrets in physic and chirurgery. Chirurgery is an early spelling of surgery, and it covered that part of medical science and art which required manual operation. Physic, on the other hand, refers to the use of herbal remedies, whether as cordials, pills, ointments, suppositories, enemas, or aromatherapy. Midwives were practicing physic when they applied baths, ointments, and various fumigations to their patients. They were practicing surgery when they used their hands to deliver babies. The midwife might also use tools, especially for a C-section, which was normally conducted when the mother had already died. She would also have access to a chair or even possibly a birthing stool. Interestingly, both physic and surgery figure in the nurse's recollection of care. The wormwood applied to her nipples is a bitter ointment, and the toddler who fell and hurt her head may have required a plaster of some kind. Such skills are part of the nurse's job description, part of her basic competencies. Woolley's Guide to Domestic Service sketches the rudiments of what nursing scholar Davina Allen calls a strategic action field. That's a social order in which actors work together in a shared field of goals, routines, and technologies. Birthing manuals refer to the midwife herself, but also to nursemaids and other female attendants in a space that is filled with linens, remedies, chairs, heating devices, and bathing equipment, as seen in this picture of the birth of Mary. Notice on the shelf that there are vessels that might hold ointments and cordials. A Hebrew inscription that begins Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh graces the wall. And in the middle ground, a woman is tending a fire, making sure that the temperature of the room is appropriate. This unusually direct image from 1800 depicts a birthing chair. Notice the other remedies on hand. A midwife and a nurse are present, but there's also a man midwife. Those are the surgeons who had begun to displace women midwives by the end of the 18th century. The wealthy urban household in Romeo and Juliet includes the nurse, serving men, retainers, pages, and musicians. Tools and technologies at hand include clocks and torches, pots and pans, masks and marzipan, gloves and dishcloths, swords and sonnets, and a very handy rope ladder. The household's busy organizational space reflects the theater's own organizational structures, an ensemble of thespians, bookkeepers, and stagehands in command of an inventory of objects. This title page from 1623 captures the manifold skills and environments that the nurse manages over the course of Shakespeare's play. You see physic and surgeries listed first, and after that, the ordering of great feasts. Think of the Capulet ball where Romeo and Juliet meet, but also the wedding party that Lord Capulet directs the nurse to organize for Juliet in Paris later in the play. The housekeeper must also be able to make distillations and perfumes, which would be medicinal as well as cosmetic. This is a beautiful Italian apothecary jar from the period. Imagine picking that up from CVS. At one point in the play, the nurse calls for aqua vita. That's a form of ethanol distilled from wine and often further enriched with spices. This cure-all is good for swelling of the lungs, heartburn, and melancholy and phlegm. Aqua mirabilis indeed. Creating such concoctions took skill and specialized equipment. You can see a housekeeper making medicinal cordials with a limbeck here. So the housekeeper is a kitchen physician in a complex organizational space, as she is named in this title page from 1689. As the household rushes to arrange Juliet's marriage to the father's chosen suitor, a guy named Paris, Lord Capulet calls the nurse to, quote, fetch more spices. And he also calls her by her name, Angelica. Angelica is a plant used medicinally as well as for flavoring. The nurse's close association with the friar, who actually grows plants for their medical virtues, further links the nurse to household medical know-how. And indeed, Romeo and Juliet features a description of an actual Renaissance apothecary shop where Romeo picks up some poison while weekending in Mantua. It might have looked like this, or even like this, because Romeo actually mentions alligators. This room is like a library or database of remedies, another example of organizational space. Although nurses were associated primarily with birth and early childhood, nurses could also be sick nurses, drafted from within the household to care for the diseased, the dying, and the dead. Here is a maidservant keeping watch over a bedridden person. And here is another maidservant feeding someone who is ill. In the Comedy of Errors, Adriana, concerned that her husband has gone mad, says that she will attend to my husband, be his nurse, diet his sickness, for it is my office. An office is an ensemble of duties. An office implies organizational as well as emotional intelligence. In Romeo and Juliet, the nurse is birth, bride, and death attendant. She is a curator of transitions, a term that nursing scholars use to describe the crises and eventualities, as well as the micro changes that nurses oversee and adjudicate. Understanding transitions, writes nursing scholar Patricia Benner, necessarily engages historical reasoning. Juliet's nurse enlists historical reasoning when she contributes her attention, care, and concern, as well as her memory and her storytelling capacities to her charges, needs, and desires, along with a generous serving of aqua vita, the water of life, the flow of process, distilled or abstracted into a sweet cordial of skillful care and organizational smarts. So, the nurse participates in the culture of know-how that is amply demonstrated in the period's midwifery and housekeeping manuals. But Miriam Bender and her nursing philosopher co-authors aim higher than epistemology or the science of knowing. They are after ontology, or the philosophy of being. What is the nature of the reality addressed in nursing? Is there a metaphysics or meta paradigm that establishes what counts as real for nurses and nursing science? Bender finds an answer in process philosophy, which really has its roots in the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who declared famously that reality is a river. But process philosophy receives its modern articulation in the writings of Alfred Whitehead. Process is what is, and nursing is ultimately an art of responding to processes, from the great transitions of life and death to the tiny changes that signal the shift in an illness, the lurch towards birth, or the onset of morbidity. The basic points, as I understand them, are these. First, reality is composed of processes, which include natural, psychic, and social phenomena. Second, different disciplines and practices organize reality, the reality of process, based on their own working concepts and organizing goals. 3, the practices of a discipline continually perform and indeed bring into being these key concepts and the reality that they compose. In nursing, these concepts include nursing itself, person, environment, and health, all of which we've touched on today. And one consequence of this is that nursing and nursing science are inherently dynamic and never deterministic. Although we have already touched on elements of this meta paradigm in the nurses' performances of care, I think we really need to go to Shakespeare's later, deeper works to find some parallels. So I would like to spend my remaining time with Edgar in King Lear. Remember that Edgar is the young man who gave me the title of this talk. And then Shakespeare's Cleopatra. And I'm also going to spend some time with an intriguing passage from my favorite midwife, Mrs. Jane Sharp. We already saw that Edgar identifies himself with nursing when he says that he came to know his father's sufferings by nursing them. He describes himself as pregnant to good pity, and he acts as a kind of midwife or doula to his father's death. So how does he exactly do that? What is the course of treatment here? When Edgar meets his recently blinded father, Gloucester is in despair, not only over his loss of vision, but over his realization that he had falsely accused his son, that same Edgar, of conspiring against him. And now he wants to die. And he asks the disguised Edgar to lead him to the edge of Dover Cliff, where he plans to leap to his death. That's a big ask, and Edgar doesn't quite know what to do. He could tell his father then and there who he is, but he's worried that this knowledge will simply kill his father. And he also seems to intuit that this journey to Dover could have its own therapeutic effects. It's a pilgrimage and a meditative exercise that might promise some rehab and repair. As they near Dover, Edgar guides his father through an imaginary fall from the heights of the cliff to the shore beneath, using visual description to create the mental picture of the scene from above. It's a description, but it's also an abstraction in the sense developed by Bender and Holmes, since the word picture leads Gloucester into the vanishing point that is the destination of the exercise. Edgar, in fact, must design and assess multiple plans on the fly: assisted suicide or outright refusal of his father's wishes. Can he devise a course of care that might both respect and prevent his father's death wish, while also preparing him for recognition and a softer way of dying? Let's look at the scene.
When shall I come to the top of that same hill?
You do climb up it now. Look how we labour.
He thinks the ground is even.
Horrible steep. Hark, do you hear the sea?
No, truly.
Why then, your other senses growing perfect by your eyes' anguish.
So may it be indeed.
Come on, sir. Here's the place. Stand still. How fearful and dizzy 'tis to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air show scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire. Dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appear like mice. And yon tall anchoring bark, diminished to her cock a boy almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebbles chafes cannot be heard so high.
Set me where you stand.
Give me your hand. You're now within a foot of the extreme verge.
Here, my friend, is a jewel, well worth a poor man's taking. Go thou farther off. Bid me farewell, and let me hear thee going.
Now fare ye well, good sir.
With all my heart.
Why I do trifle thus with his despair is done to cure it.
O you mighty gods, this world I do renounce, and in your sights shake patiently my great affliction off, if I could bear it longer, and not fall to quarrel with thy great opposeless wills. My snuffed, loathing part of nature should burn itself out. If Edgar live, oh bless him. Now, fellow, fare thee well.
Gone, sir, farewell. Oh, you, sir? Friend, hear you, sir? Speak! Yet he revives. What are you, sir?
Away and let me die.
Hadst thou been aught but gossamer, feathers, air, so many fathoms down precipitating thou shivered like an egg. 10 masts at each meant not the altitude which thou hast perpendicularly fell. Thy life's a miracle. Speak yet again.
Yet have I fallen or no?
From the dread summit of this chalky bourne.
Oh.
Do but look up.
Alack, I have no eyes. Is wretchedness deprived that benefit to end itself by death?
Up! So, how is they feeling your legs? You stand.
Too well, too well.
This is above all strangeness. Upon the crown of the cliff, what thing was that which parted from you?
A poor unfortunate beggar.
As I stood here below, methought his eyes were 2 full moons. He had 1,000 noses, horns whelked and waved like the enrigid sea. It was some fiend. Therefore, thou happy father. Think that the clearest gods who make them honours of men's impossibilities have here preserved thee.
I do remember now. Henceforth, I'll bear affliction till it do cry out itself, enough, enough, and die.
Many readers have criticized Edgar for deceiving his father, but I see the two of them as co-composing this experience together. It's Gloucester, the father, who initiates the journey and who begins to sketch its final image in their mind's eyes, while Edgar guides them forward and completes the picture. Nursing philosopher Jean Watson seeks wisdom from what she calls, quote, ancient and even modern practices of suggestion, visualization, imagery, and belief, close quote. Techniques that also describe Edgar's unusual, but not wholly unprecedented approach to palliative care. So where is the process philosophy in this scene? Here I want to return to midwife Jane Sharp, who comments at several points in her treatise on the role of the imagination in well-being. In the anatomy section of her book, the imagination contributes to both male and female sexual functioning. She has a wonderful section on the clitoris. Later, in a brief discourse on the healthful effects of fresh air, she groups together a range of psychic functions in a picture of well-being that literally belongs to the atmosphere we breathe. Fresh air makes the reason and understanding ready. Good vital and animal spirits are bred by it, whereby all things to reason become more subservient. Opinion, fancy, judgment, resolution, apprehension, imagination, memory, knowledge, mirth, hope, trust, joy, and urbanity are produced by it. Meats and drinks feed the body, but the air guides the mind in almost all of its actions. And life and health, sickness and death depend most upon it. Sharp is considering fresh air pragmatically from the perspective of health and well-being, but I think something more is going on here. By associating air with the atmosphere we breathe, with the thoughts we think, with the emotions we feel, with the sociable virtues we practice, and with our animal spirits or vitality, she is really addressing air as one of the four elements in ancient cosmologies, along with fire, earth, and water. The ancient Stoics saw pneuma, air, spirit, breath of life, as actually a combination of fire and air. And it's this pneuma that constitutes the human soul or psyche, but also existed in inanimate objects as the tensile force that organizes matter. Edgar leads his father through a fabrication built from pneuma, the airy nothing of its speech, the breath of their shared presence, and the creaturely vitality that surrounds them. In concert with his father, he performs Sharp's comportments of imagination, memory, hope, and trust in relation to the horizons of life and death that he, as nurse and midwife, shepherds with such care. Notice how in the clip we just watched, Edgar closes his eyes to create the mental experience that the two of them are sharing. In conjuring the imagined reality of Dover Cliff through spoken words and shared gestures, Nurse Edgar is composing a reality of processes whose flows include animal and vegetable life, the efforts of work and labor, the murmuring surge of the sea, and the hermeneutic burdens and pressures of a distinctively human life and death. The process power of fire and air return at the end of Antony and Cleopatra. It may seem odd to think of Cleopatra as a nurse, but the historical Cleopatra was associated with a range of medical writings, including tracts on gynecology, cosmetics, and alchemy. Both Plutarch and Shakespeare report that Cleopatra conducted empirical research on the easiest ways to die. She wanted to find a poison that would leave her body beautiful and intact rather than swollen or covered with a vile and loathsome crust like King Hamlet. Here's an apothecary jar with Cleopatra painted on its surface. Do the contents promise beauty, an easy death, or both? Surrounded by her women and sequestered in her monument at the end of the play, Cleopatra carefully plans and performs her own death. When she puts the snake to her breast, she describes herself as nursing it. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast that sucks the nurse asleep? Here you see her surrounded by her attendants in a kind of birth chair that is also a death chair. Edgar was midwife to his father's death. Cleopatra is midwife to her own death. I talked about abstraction earlier as a way of understanding the kind of careful memory notation that the nurse performs with Juliet and Lady Capulet, and that Edgar practices with his father. Cleopatra understands her own death as a kind of abstraction, as she wills herself to become one with the cosmos. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. Fire and air. Well, that recalls the pneuma of the Stoics and the primal fire of Heraclitus, whom Bender and Holmes describe as the first process philosopher. In willing herself to become fire and air, she is abstracting herself. Bender and Holmes write that abstractions extend the world rather than correspond to it, and they argue that the world that is so extended is continually brought into being by the nurse's performance of care. In Cleopatra's death scene, she speaks and acts like a philosopher as well as a nurse, conjuring a reality composed of processes to which she commits her living, dying being. Ontology involves metaphysics, not a word that is handled kindly in most scholarly discourses today. Yet Professor Bender is courageously engaging metaphysics by putting questions of being at the center of nursing. In that spirit, I want to tell a little story about metaphysics and care. In the spring of 2020, as part of my recovery from a traffic accident, I spent many hours a week with a gifted physical therapist named Dawn. Towards the end of our time together, we came to speak about matters of meaning. Curious about the cross that she wore around her neck, I asked her if she had always been a religious person. She replied slowly, even cautiously, "No, not really. It was during the first years of my work as a physical therapist. I realized that when I was helping people in their healing process, God was working through me." Was Dawn being fanciful or self-aggrandizing or mystical? Or was she actually articulating a truth about how the forms of vitality and capacity practiced and fostered in care extend beyond the two partners in healing to touch not only families and workplaces, but the operation, the processes of the world itself? Now, Dawn clearly had a personal God in mind, but I think one can also think like Heraclitus and the Stoics, who understood fire and air as processes shared across the cosmos, processes in which health and well-being participate. So to know by nursing is to intuit in and through the intimate tactility of tending to the birth, growth, healing, or dying of another person, a sense of purpose and meaning, of telos or goal. The four elements, the four humors, the river of being, the fresh air of Jane Sharp, the resonant imaginings of Edgar and Gloucester, and the fire and air of Cleopatra are all efforts or abstractions that seek to understand life and death and the reality renewing care for life and death as processes that concern being in an existential and metaphysical sense. And I find that very exciting. Let's give Cleopatra, queen, scientist, philosopher, midwife, and nurse, the last words.
Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. Now no more the juice of Egypt's grape shall moist this lip. Yar, yar, good Iris, quick. Methinks I hear Antony call. I see him rouse himself to praise my noble act. I hear him mock the luck of Caesar, which the gods give men to excuse their afterwrath. Husband, I come. Now to that name my courage prove my title. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. So, have you done? Come then, and take the last warmth of my lip. Farewell, kind Charmian. Iris, long farewell. Have I the aspic in my lips? Dost fall? If thou and nature can so gently part, the stroke of death is as a lover's pinch, which hurts and is desired. Dost thou lie still? If thus thou vanishest, thou tells the world it is not worth leave taking. This proves me base. If first she meet the curled Antony, he'll make demand of her and spend that kiss which is my heaven to have. Come, thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. Oh, couldst thou speak that I might hear thee call great Caesar ass unpolicied. Oh, peace, peace. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast? That sucks the nurse asleep. Oh, sweet as balm, as soft as air, as gentle. Oh, Antony. Nay, I will take thee too. What? Should I stay